Hi, welcome to Parrot and Wolf. Today we're going to continue with modal verbs in English. Remember, the big difference between modal verbs and main verbs is modal verbs modify and affect the main verb. You don't usually use modals on their own. In the last video, we saw how to use modal verbs to describe possibility, probability, imaginary situations, and permission. In this video, we'll see how to use modal verbs to describe obligations, advice, necessity, and certainty. So let's look at obligations and advice first. I should go to the cinema. This simple sentence describes going to the cinema, but now the modal verb should describes an obligation. This means there is a reason or responsibility for you to do the action. Now let's think. Do you have a responsibility to do it? Yes. But do you have a choice? Yes. So there's a responsibility or an obligation to do the action, but importantly, you still have a choice. Now be careful with this one, because when talking to other people in the second person, should is usually used for suggestions and advice. For example, you should call your family tonight to let them know you arrived at the hotel safely. There is a little bit of obligation here, but the main meaning is advice. This means you think it's a good idea for the person to do the action. You are advising them, so it's advice. As an alternative to should, we can use ought to. I ought to go to the cinema. Now, using ought to or should for obligation and advice has exactly the same meaning, and native speakers use both modal verbs, usually to avoid repetition, although should is more popular and colloquial, while ought to is much more formal. Some other examples are, we should finish our homework before we go out, and you ought to read less lifestyle magazines. Now, what happens when we want a very strong obligation? For example, when there is very little choice to do something. Well, instead of should and ought to, we use have to and must. I have to go to the cinema. I must go to the cinema. Both of these examples describe obligation in the same way as should and ought to. However, the important difference is the obligation or responsibility is much stronger. Must and have to are used for rules and laws. You still have a choice, of course, but your choice is extremely limited and there are consequences if you ignore it. Some other examples are, children must go to school, you have to pay tax. Lastly, there are some differences when should, ought to, have to, and must are used in a negative form, and it's quite surprising. Have a look at this. I should not go to the cinema. I ought not to be late. I must not walk on the grass. I do not have to eat meat. The first three examples, should not, ought not, and must not, still show obligation, but this time it's the obligation or responsibility to not do something. In these cases, you have an obligation to not go to the cinema, to not walk on the grass, and to be early. Be careful though, there's a big difference with do not have to. This means there is no obligation at all, so you remove the responsibility completely. Let's think. Is there obligation with should and should not? Yes. Is there obligation with ought to and ought not to? Yes. Is there obligation with must and must not? Yes, a strong obligation. Is there obligation with have to? Yes, a strong obligation. And is there obligation with do not have to? No, absolutely none. And that's the difference. Don't have to specifically shows us that there is no obligation to do the action at all. Now, let's look at necessity. I need to repair my bicycle. This sentence describes repairing a bicycle, probably the tire, and importantly, it's a necessary action. So you may ask, what's the difference between obligation and necessity? Now that's a good question. The difference is rules and law. Obligation comes from an authority, so usually it's because of an arrangement, a rule, or a law. Necessity happens without any arrangements, rules, or laws. Look at this. I should go to school today. I need to eat every day. There is no rule or law saying you should eat every day. You eat every day because it's necessary to live. Necessity is something that you do without choice, but also with no authority telling you. No rule and no law. Some other examples are, we need to improve our performance to beat the competition, and you need to wash your clothes. Okay, so we've looked at obligation, advice, and necessity. Finally, let's get on to certainty. I saw John 2 minutes ago. He must still be in the office. This sentence has two parts and describes a situation in an office. The first part is the evidence, and the second part is the certainty using must. You're certain or 100% sure that John is in the office. Be careful. Remember we used must earlier for obligation? The meaning here is different. In this situation, it describes certainty, something you are very, very sure of. Let's think. When did you see John? Very recently, 2 minutes ago. Is it possible he's still in the office? Yes, absolutely. Is it likely he's still in the office? Yes, absolutely. So are you very certain? Yes, 100%. And is there any obligation? No. So we use must to describe certainty, and the meaning is clear from the context and the situation. Unfortunately, when we want to be very sure and certain about a negative action or state, we don't use must, we use can't. Nothing's easy, is it? Let's have a look. I saw John 5 hours ago. He can't still be in the office. This sentence still describes certainty, but the difference is you're certain John is not in the office. Let's think. When did you see John? A while ago, 5 hours ago. Is it possible he's still in the office? Yes. Is it likely he's still in the office? No, it's very unlikely. So are you very certain? Yes. We use can't to describe certainty of a negative action or state, and the meaning is clear from the context and situation. Now remember, modal verbs are sometimes used freely by native speakers outside of the grammar rules. But don't worry, concentrate on the language in these lessons and you'll have an excellent set of tools to speak accurately, fluently, and express yourself fully. Now, let's review how we form modal verbs correctly. The first form is modal verb plus bare infinitive. In the sentence, he must be at the cinema, he is the subject, must is the modal verb, be is the bare infinitive form of to be, and at the cinema is the object. The good news is this form stays the same with every subject. The other modal verb should uses the same form. I should go to the cinema, I should not eat so much cheese. Now the second form is also very similar, modal verb plus bare infinitive. In the sentence, I have to go to the cinema, I is the subject, have to is the modal verb, go is the bare infinitive form of to go, and to the cinema is the object. Remember though, with this second form, be careful with the subject in the third person he, she, it form. He, she, it has to go. The other modal verbs ought to and need to use the same form as this. The changes are, I ought to go to the cinema, he ought to go to the cinema, I need to go to the cinema, she needs to go to the cinema. Again, check the subject. Also, need to and ought to use a different form in the negative. I ought not to go to the cinema, check the position of not, and I need not go to the cinema. There's no preposition to. So, in regards to English pronunciation, we always contract the verb forms, as you know, especially in negative forms. For example, she must not eat prawns becomes she mustn't eat prawns. They should not drive tonight becomes they shouldn't drive tonight. I need not go to the cinema becomes I needn't go to the cinema. And he cannot still be here becomes he can't still be here. Remember the R sound like car for can't. These contractions are common when speaking and writing, but of course informal when writing. So, to summarize, modal verbs are used with other main verbs. Modal verbs modify the main verbs with added meaning and always contract the negative verb forms. To find out more about learning English for Cambridge and IELTS exams, business and work, or general conversation, visit ParrotandWolf.com.